Capita envisions a future in which families and communities can flourish. By prioritizing families and their communities, we have the potential to radically transform the fabric of our societies for the long term. In this series of Capita in Conversation, we talk to interviewees from around the world to hear their stories, knowledge, wisdom, and ideas on how to craft effective policies for a future in which families and their communities can flourish. In this episode, CEO Joe Waters speaks with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Dele Olojede, who was in Pretoria on May 10, 1994, covering Nelson Mandela's inauguration and the formal transition to democracy in South Africa. The following day, he flew to Kigali to cover the early days of the Rwandan genocide. In just a matter of days, Dele witnessed both the best of humanity and its greatest depravities. As South Africa marks the 30th anniversary of democracy, Dele shares his insights and wisdom. The conversation also delves into current challenges in the U.S., the critical role of leadership in navigating today's societal transformations, and the importance of a long-term perspective. This episode, introduced by Capita Board Chair Nicole Biondi, was recorded in November 2024 at a Capita Salon in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Good evening and welcome. As you may be able to tell from my accent, I'm not from around here. I am, in fact, from Cape Town, South Africa. My name is Nicole Biondi, and I am the chair of Capita's board. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here this evening. Capita is an independent think tank and community. We explore the major transformations of our time, things like demographic shifts and the changing climate. And we anticipate their potential impacts on a future in which families and their communities can flourish. The salon tonight is a part of that work. These gatherings are where we explore with intention and openness the questions that shape societies and our roles within them, helping us cultivate the kind of deep and lasting change that Capita envisions. And in that spirit, it is truly an honor to welcome Dele Olojede. Dele and Capita share many values, but I think the one I appreciate most is his sense of deep hospitality. Dele has this uncanny way of bringing people together, not only as a remarkable curator and convener, but as someone who knows the power of shared experiences and conversations. And let me add, he has an excellent wine cellar. Dele always brings both wisdom and a good glass to the table. Now tonight, in conversation with Joe Waters, the CEO of Capita, Dele is going to be reflecting on 30 years since the end of apartheid in South Africa and the aftermath of the Rwandan tragic genocide. Pivotal moments Dele reported on in ways that shaped global understanding. As we listen to Dele's reflections on the civic leadership it takes to build good societies from these complex and often painful histories, we're invited to consider the triumphs and struggles of South Africa and Rwanda's distinct choices. The embrace of freedom in one, the prioritization of security in the other. And with these examples in mind, we'll explore what sort of leadership and society building we need to explore to enable flourishing in a world marked by profound challenges. It's a privilege to have Dele with us tonight, sharing his experiences and insights as someone who continues to inspire, challenge, and convene us toward a better future. Please join me in welcoming Dele Olojede and Joe Waters.
Good evening. Dele, so glad to have you here in the Carolinas. So I was with Dele last March 2023, at his home in Stellenbosch. He moderated a seminar part of my fellowship at the Aspen Institute, which was amazing and wonderful. And then we were together again in May this year in Washington, D.C. And I heard that Dele was supposed to be coming to Durham. And I said, well, let's go ahead and get you in Charlotte for a conversation. And so I'm glad that it worked out. His kid sister lives here in Charlotte. And so it was fortuitous that you were able to visit with her, spend time with her, and also to spend time with us. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
No,
Nice.
No, she's not here today. Yeah.
She's a banker. They work all the time. They pretend to work all the time.
Dele, I want to dive right in.
All right.
You are an occasional resident of the United States. You're a keen observer of America. You worked for an American newspaper, Newsday, for many, many years. And we had an election last week.
I was there. I voted.
Were you surprised?
I was not. Having been chastened in 2016, when I actually lost money betting with a friend that, I know America so well, they'll never elect Trump. So the guy says he's going to win. I said, no, he's not. If you really believe that, let's put money on the table. So he took my money a few days later. So this time, my antenna was way up. And when I saw all the polls, and the polls claimed that they were 50-50, I knew that Trump was winning. So when I got on the plane in Cape Town to fly to New York on time to vote on Tuesday last week, it was with the full expectation that by Wednesday morning, Trump will be president. So I was not surprised in any way. There are many reasons for that. People have their takes. I'm actually sick and tired of hearing these takes. Personally, people are just fed up and they're looking for something else and they're shaking the trees, as we would all do when we don't like the direction things are going and nobody seems to be listening. So I was not surprised.
With that, let's turn to Africa.
Okay. Oh, by the way, on Tuesday, in anticipation that Trump will win, I'd arranged to meet with a few of our fellows and fellow Aspen people in New York on election night for what we call election watch, which meant we would dine very, very well, and we would drink too much, and we would watch the result trickle in. And I think by 10 p.m. it was pretty clear where things were going, so we switched from wine to whiskey. That was the end of it.
I believe I've heard you say that you were in Pretoria on May 10th, 1994.
Cape Town. No, it was Pretoria. Mandela was born in Pretoria.
You knew Mandela, you saw him up close, you knew his character, you were there for the inauguration, you covered the transition to democracy. I just want to hear more about that. What was that like? What was he like?
It's when you're just privileged to be born at a certain time and to be in certain places, you don't know until afterwards how much of a privilege that was. I will say that Mandela and possibly Desmond Tutu are the only two people I've ever met, and I've been to 120 countries around the world, warlords and gangsters and presidents and politicians. Sometimes you can't tell the difference. And I've seen people in various settings, and these two men are the people who are more impressive in person than what you see on TV. They're extraordinary human beings. So when South Africa went into its inevitable nosedive, from which it is now trying to emerge, I would just laugh at my South African friends and said, welcome to the real world. What you had was an unusual constellation of things that produced leaders like that in a particular moment in the country. The United States experienced that probably 200, 250 years ago, where you just have an agglomeration of just exceptional people. South Africa had that. And because of that, I learned the greatest lessons of my life, just being there and being immersed in this transition process when a country is in the process of being born.
And those lessons, what are they?
Well, the one thing is that you understand that perfection is unattainable, so we should aspire to progress, right? That's also probably a function of my now being deep in my 60s. I'm no longer the firebrand, utopian young journalist that I was in the early 80s when Andrew was a U.S. diplomat in Lagos. Hello, my fellow Nigerian. As well as Liz, his daughter, who was a teenager in Lagos. So these are my people. You are also my people, but these are my special people. So that was one big lesson for me, just like philosophically, how do you look at the world? We are never going to get perfection. I didn't believe this when I was younger, but now I understand that even progress is to be celebrated and is actually quite fine, right? So the second lesson I learned was that leadership is not just essential, that is the absolutely crucial ingredient to whether societies flourish or collapse into violence and disorder or wars. And I will give one example of something I witnessed personally in South Africa in 1993. A very charismatic leader in the liberation movement called Chris Hani, who at that time, probably apart from Mandela, was the most revered figure among black South Africans. He was murdered by a white guy as he stood in his driveway on a Sunday morning. And the country was in the middle of negotiations to end apartheid, which was very fraught. And so things were going to blow. And Frederick W. de Klerk, who was then the president of South Africa, called Mandela to say, I can't talk to the country, you have to do it. In fact, in my view, that was the day power shifted in South Africa, not a year later when they had the inauguration and so on. And Mandela got on public TV and talked to the country that people should remember, he said, that the reason police were able to arrest the person who killed Chris Hani so quickly was because the white neighbors took down the number plates from the car as it fled and described the person. He said it was white neighbors of Chris Hani who allowed the state to arrest, but nobody was listening. So he started a series of rallies around the black townships and so on, talking to people to try to calm them. I was covering one such incident, and it was dusk. The sun was going down over the veldt in South Africa's great escarpment in the north, Johannesburg general area. And there was this very mad crowd, and they were singing this liberation song and stomping and saying, kill the Boer, meaning kill white people, and so on. So Mandela kept saying, nobody's going to get killed under my watch. You're not killing any white people or red people or yellow people. But the young people were singing, let's kill all the white people. So he said, if you're not going to listen to me, then maybe you should look for another leader, because I'm not going to be that person who presides over where innocent people are killed. And so this sacrilege of the idea that they should look for a different leader was so shocking to the crowd that they fell into a hush. And then towards the back of the crowd, a woman started singing in one of the African languages that I didn't understand, but you could hear the anguish and the pain and the longing in the song. And in that very special South African way, people put themselves in the different registers and they started singing together quite harmoniously. And the crowd slowly surrounded Mandela and he started singing with them. And the tension of the moment was gone. Where does that come from in a human being? I don't know. But the lesson I took from that is, if we do not have the good leaders stepping forward, our institutions have no chance. Because institutions are made of people. So that was my second lesson there. There were many other lessons, but I think those two are probably enough for now.
Yeah, wonderful. So May 10th, 1994, I believe the next day you got on a plane.
And went to Rwanda.
Where you were receiving initial reports as a reporter for Newsday that there was a genocide underway. Mm-hmm. That's an incredible dichotomy from the promise of South African democracy
to the absolute bloodletting darkness of Rwanda. Yeah. So and that's human beings for you, that's Africa for you, and that's the world for you. I remember 20 years ago when I won the Pulitzer Prize, I became a star for about 15 seconds. Right? So people would interview me. The World Bank called me to come and talk to their board about what their role should be in the world. I said, me. I mean, I was the same guy yesterday, right? But anyway, so I was being interviewed on NPR one day, and this woman very honestly, she says, well, what did it make you feel as an African to see these Africans just killing one another like that? Now, I'd got this question a few times in different interviews before, and I was always stumped by it. I didn't know how to answer it, but this time I was ready. And my response was, I was disappointed that I thought Africans were special people. Turns out that they were just like other human beings, like the Germans and the Indonesians and the Turks who killed the Armenians. I always thought African people were special. These people have now proven to me that they're just like other human beings. And there was a dead silence from Kigali. So this was the thing with Rwanda, right? That you get the extraordinary story of human achievement in the peaceful end of apartheid, literally going on side by side with the absolute dark depths of human behavior in the Rwandan genocide, and I had to cover both. So it was. I don't think anything else in my life has ever affected me as much as experiencing those two things simultaneously. Yeah.
So both countries have followed their own trajectories over the last 30 years. Mm-hmm. You alluded already to some of the challenges that South Africa has had recently, and maybe it's coming up. Mm-hmm. Nicole and I were talking even this week about the challenge of promise, 1994, to the corruption
of the Zuma years.
Zuma years, and now maybe we're coming up. But just could you reflect for us on the struggle? There's been there was the anti-apartheid struggle. There was the resistance before 1994. But now there's still a struggle.
Yes. The current struggle is the worst one in many ways, because there is something about the yearning for freedom and the struggle for it that is so pure and so elevating, and you're willing to do anything for it. Now, fixing potholes and picking up the garbage and making sure the electricity runs on time, that doesn't rise to the same level. So there is a natural letdown in the country, having experienced such a high of human achievement, because you had absolutely different, and turns out they're not different people, coming together to try and forge a different path. There is nothing more inspiring than that. But having attained that, I even did a bunch of stories about how the artist community in South Africa was at a loss for what to do, because they'd been so focused the previous 20, 30 years in music, in art, in poetry, in all kinds of creative pursuits, influenced by the drive to end apartheid as something that is inarguably evil. And now apartheid is dead. What do we do now? And they couldn't create art that moved anymore. Like almost uniformly, there was like a downdraft there. And I think politically that also happened, although that was delayed for about 15 years before the slide began, quite precipitously. So Mandela always saw himself as a bridge, and that's why he absolutely rejected all the attempts to make him run for a second term, which the Constitution allowed, on the argument that he was too old, and they trained lots of younger people who could step into leadership, and that if they could not step in, it meant they had failed to prepare them. But he was not going to run for a second term. The BBC has this famous thing they show occasionally in their newsreel thing, "Don't call me, I'll call you." So he said he was going to his grandchildren. It was going to be the first time in his life that he was going to have a normal family life, and that could only happen with the grandchildren because he'd already lost the children, right? So when the real extraordinary sense of their coming together to build a new country got everybody working together. And soon enough, people being as they are and the law as we might become, they started fragmenting. People started looking for money and looking for power. And eventually, the bad guys won within the ruling party and the country headed downhill. That was the Zuma years. They were pretty terrible, right? So the lesson one draws from that is that things don't stay good. They constantly need work. They don't stay bad either. We can work on it and try to make it better. Hence, my lack of despairing over the results of last week's election. Actually, I'm feeling rather lightheaded. I think this is just fine. Occasionally, you need a shock to the system and for people to recalibrate and figure out a way forward. Now, I see the kind of people that Trump has been naming to his cabinet. They wouldn't be my choice. But the guy won an election, right? And let's hope that the system remains strong enough to buy us some runway until we come to our senses as a country and begin to remember what made America great to start with, which was this desire to constantly expand the frontiers of freedom and of opportunity. I know of no mission statement ever written that's better than we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. This is a slave state. And knowing that, they still write that as a statement of their ambition. There is something extraordinarily powerful about that, because you have now something to measure yourself against constantly. There has been no republic in the history of the world that has attempted the kind of things that this country has done. So that's why I'm not giving up on the United States. I still have my romantic ideas about it, and I'll go to my grave with it. We hold these truths to be self-evident. I tell people small things that they didn't pay attention to, that they're shocked when they hear it. I said, do you know that if you were born in Japan, you cannot be a Japanese? If you were born in China, you cannot be Chinese. If you were born in India, you cannot be Indian, unless you were ethnically Japanese or Chinese or Indian and so on. That, in fact, this is the default position of most of the world. America is the experiment that's telling us that you can bring people from everywhere and only their citizenship defines them. Now, the fact that we struggle to get to that aspiration does not make it any less important that that is the aspiration of the country. And so to me, I'm happy as a clam. You give me a little Macallan, I will talk to you tomorrow. You know, the country is going to be fine. Yeah. So that's kind of the way I see the South African transition itself. People, to copy my young adult daughters, people are going to people. Apparently everything is a verb nowadays, right? The South Africans were just peopling by taking a beautiful thing and attempting to crash it. And then they woke up one morning and they said, actually, this is not the promise we made to ourselves. Can we find a different way? And their elections delivered a heavy clap to the ruling party that liberated them and no longer has a majority in parliament. So it has to go into coalition with other parties in order to run the country. And now they're actually attempting to dig themselves out of a hole. This is the way we are. If something is going nicely for us, we say we're bored with this. Let's crash it a little bit and trash it. This is the way people are. So it's going to come out all right. And for the same reason, I believe in the idea of this United States and the fact that it gave human beings an evolutionary destination to aspire to, which had never existed before. So order a drink and be merry. We're going to be fine.
Help yourself. Feel free. Yes. I have two more questions, and then I want to hear from all of you. The first is, Dele, you're on your way to Montgomery,
Yes.
Alabama, to moderate
I'm practicing my y'all already. So
y'all. Moderate a seminar. As somebody who's born and raised in South Carolina, I have been fascinated since making my first trip to South Africa in 2017 by the parallels between South African apartheid and Southern apartheid, which we call Jim Crow, right? And I think in some ways one of the things I most admire about South Africa, and it is imperfect, is how you all have reckoned with the legacy of apartheid. There was a truth and reconciliation process. There are museums. And I feel like we're just now with, for example, the work Brian Stevenson is doing in Montgomery, we're just now 40, 50 years after the fact wrestling with this, right? Is sort of an awakening for me as a South Carolinian that what I was taught in third grade history, that South Carolina was a 300-something-year-old democracy, was not true. That, in fact, we were really a 50-year democracy or less, right? That was the,
a
black
kind of awakening for you.
Right, it was an awakening. So, and then sort of seeing my own region in light of South Africa. So just how do you see us as in the American South? How do you see how we have reckoned or failed to reckon with the history of our own apartheid?
Yeah, I rely on the millennials for my new language now. You're just peopling, that's all. People will people, right? There is no human being on the face of the earth, and I've encountered many, many, many of them in different lands, in different cultures, that think it's fun to admit that something with which they've been intimately engaged and perhaps even built is wrong, or has aspects of it that they're not proud of. Nobody goes and says, look how terrible these things I did are. So I'm not surprised, but it's a completely natural human reaction to when we wake up one day and say, why were we like that, right? But the case of South Africa is not that usual in the sense that it's only military force that has compelled the accounting for things that people did in the past, whether it's Nuremberg and so on. Nuremberg was simply because the Allies won. If they didn't win, there's no Nuremberg, right? Nobody likes to dig into this. And so I am not, I don't think it marks South Carolinians, who are going to be my gracious and happy hosts from Saturday, to be any different from people anywhere else who are grappling with some of the aspects of our past that we're not proud of. I think the crucial difference in South Africa is that they got lucky about the leadership they had at the time of their transition, which insisted that that should be done but in a humane way. In other words, if you had a technocratic leader in 1994, you don't have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But you had inspirational leaders who thought, for the health of the society, let us bring these things out, but in a loving and gentle way. For example, they were not going to go after anyone, no matter how terrible what you did was, so long as you confess to it and sought atonement, apologize to the family, whatever, right? So the Rwandans are an interesting case because Rwanda is a place that had, and I think still has, capital punishment, right, for murder. Now, 60% of the population actively participated in murder, either directly killing or facilitating the killing of fellow citizens. So if you go strictly by law, you are going to have to kill 60% of your population. Obviously, that makes no sense. So in a situation of a perfect crime, justice is impossible, literally defined. Right? You may seek for something above justice, such as the possibility that a particular people can construct a different future if you gave them the chance. So the Rwandans looked into their traditions and decided to go with what they call the Gacaca system, which was not too dissimilar from the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Archbishop Tutu presided over, except in this way. You will come into the village square, and every village had these hearings, and it was imperfect, and the innocent can be wrongfully sort of disgraced in public, whatever. But what they did was to say, everybody, they were going after only the top 1,000 people involved in directing and instigating the genocide. Everybody else, they said, go back to your village. You will have a public gathering in the village square, and you will confess to what you did and make some atonement, help to rebuild somebody's house that was burnt or whatever, and then just go in peace. Because it was literally impossible for them to do otherwise, right? So when you look at the situation in the United States, particularly the American South, and particularly states like South Carolina, migration from Saturday, they're struggling in their own way to find some kind of accommodation for the past. I thought it was an extraordinary piece that Ta-Nehisi Coates did in the Atlantic several years ago, The Case for Reparations. It opened my mind in so many other ways to things that we don't normally consider. And I particularly like the fact that he said reparation is not like just give somebody money, 40 acres and a mule. Reparation is more like an acknowledgement of something, because the past cannot be forced into being the present, right? Mm. So my attitude to life, which my daughters occasionally argue against, is that we're concerned with the now. What happens now and in the future? How do we educate the children? How do we make them decent citizens? If we pour all our emotional and intellectual energy into that pursuit, we may find that we're helping to create a far better future than trying to litigate a past that cannot be recompensed. It's just not possible, right? I call the Rwandan situation a perfect crime because it was so successful that justice is no longer tenable, right? So human beings have to figure out new ways. Leaders have to think in original ways. And my way is to just, since I cannot solve all these past problems, is to focus on the here and now. How do we care for our children, all our children now, and let them flourish into good human beings and good citizens? And that will be enough compensation for me.
So I'm going to let that be a transition to my last question. I want to hear from all of you, as I said, and that is the future is purely from a numbers perspective. This is almost a cliche phrase, but when you think about the numbers, the future is African. 1 in 10 children in the world by 2060 will be Nigerian. 1 in 4 workers in the world will be African.
Oh, I think it's more like 40%.
It
So
really
the median
is
age in Africa is like 18.
Right.
It's the only place that has the possibility of having a productive workforce.
So when you think but when you think about the care economy, when you think about the future of manufacturing, and then when you think about our immigration debates in Western Europe and in the United States, clearly we're maybe not thinking ahead.
Yeah, because right? I tell you one thing.
Because we're going to depend on Africa for the world's economic well-being. How should we be thinking about that?
So my fellow Nigerians, Andrew and Liz, are happy to welcome you as migrants to Nigeria in the next couple of decades. I think one of the things we have to think about is around climate, right? because Africa will be ground zero for that in so many ways. The energy transition. We had a young Kenyan speaker at Africa in the World back in September at Stellenbosch who came to talk about the kind of disconnect between the political leadership and the opportunities that existed, which would in part answer your question. And the argument he was making is, why are you waiting for people to say they want to invest in energy transition? You already have unlimited natural energy. So play to your strength. Get all the data centers here. Give them free energy. They are insatiable consumers of energy, and you have more unending, infinite energy than any part of the world, right? So it's not just a matter of demographics. It's also what new technologies demand that will probably place Africa in a pole position to lead a new kind of world. But these things
Well,
are
all of
never...
our minerals
Yeah.
for the iPhone come from the Congo.
But things don't go linearly like that, right? People being as they are, and the law as they might become, our crookedness and our greed and our lust for power and so on, all these things will interfere with what the numbers suggest, right? This is true of anywhere in the world. People will people. So I don't think, just because the data shows that, then that's linearly what's going to happen. I do think that the sheer throw weight of it, at least much of it will happen, maybe not all, which then means that we have to start thinking of our global arrangements in a different way. So the Security Council at the UN has been a flashpoint of that. So if you have like Britain, France in the Security Council as 5 of the members, and you don't have India, you don't have Japan, and you don't have Germany, and you don't have Nigeria, you don't have Brazil, you don't have Indonesia, and so on, it makes those arrangements probably a bit dated. And I would actually like for Andrew to weigh in on that a bit, since you've spent a global career exploring some of these issues. So we will have to come towards a different arrangement. And the Treaty of Westphalia is probably no longer sufficient for us in the way that we organize societies and what we understand to be the nation states today, because a lot of these things are now without boundaries. I didn't even know, and I think I know more than 99.9% of the world, but I didn't know that there were Chinese illegal migrants coming through the gap in Latin America, joining Senegalese, Chinese, Senegalese, Indonesians, people from like all over the place. That when you see these migrants who are trying to storm the southern border, you will see the world writ large in them. So there are just too many things that we do not yet understand or pay enough attention to about human aspiration, about human ingenuity, about how far people will go to find some kind of better life for themselves, that some of these forces are actually not stoppable. So the idea of the borders we currently have will probably fall away. I did a story once in South Africa back in '92 on the border of South Africa and Mozambique. The local chief, who's obliged by tradition to have a monthly open-air meeting with the citizens of his village, was on the Mozambican side of the border. Most of the population of his village was on the South African side. So he has to go through the border to go have what they call the imbizo with his subjects on the other side. I mean, I'm like ethnically Yoruba from Western Nigeria, but Yorubas are also next door in the Republic of Benin. You may have seen the woman warrior thing. I forget what they called them. The old women army of Dahomey. Next door, half of them are Yoruba people. Every frontier is like that. This guy sat in Berlin in 1886, 87, and just had a map on the table and drew straight lines. That's why most of the maps in Africa the boundaries are all straight, regardless of rivers or mountains and so on and so forth. Because they'd never been in Africa, and they say, okay, you Portuguese, you have this, the Spanish, the French, the Germans, whatever. So we have to come to some understanding that maybe those things are no longer fit for purpose in the world into which we are emerging, and certainly where our children and our grandchildren will emerge. And on that particular touchy issue of grandchildren, if anybody would like to speak to my daughters on my behalf, I welcome all help.
Dele Olojede, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, José.
Each episode of Capita in Conversation is produced by Michael Bettis and is available by podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as capita.org.